What would you do if you discovered that you were the one who had turned your employees' lives into a living hell? Have you ever wondered what would happen if a wealthy CEO suddenly returned to his own store and discovered a heartbreaking truth? That the system he built was silently crushing innocent people. A cashier, exhausted, trying to hide tears behind a forced smile. A young man working himself to the bone, only to be labeled unworthy of existence. And then the very man who once swore to protect them had become the one who betrayed that promise. But everything changed. In just one day, he tore down that ruthless system and gave back to those forgotten people something far more valuable than any title or money, their own sense of worth. This is not just a story about redemption. It is a question for all of us. When pushed to the edge, will you choose silence or will you stand up? Stay until the end, because the answer might just make you look at yourself differently. Eleanor Cruz smiled, a faint and fragile smile that seemed to exist only to please others, as she handed the change back to the last customer in line. Her voice trembled slightly, the words escaping her lips with the weary softness of wind slipping through the cracks of an old house. "Thank you for shopping with us." It was a phrase she had repeated hundreds of times throughout her shift, but this time it sounded different, carrying not just exhaustion, but a quiet sadness she could no longer hide. She turned away quickly, hoping no one would notice her reddened eyes that had just fought back tears. But one escaped, hastily wiped away with the sleeve of her worn-out uniform. She didn't know that a pair of eyes was watching her every small movement. From the dim corner near the checkout aisle, a man stood silently. He wore an old jacket, his hands tucked into his pockets, looking like any other ordinary customer. But he was no customer. He was Adrian Blake, the founder and CEO of Blake Mart, the name on every bright red sign hanging above these aisles. Adrian stared at Elena, his dark eyes heavy with thought. He didn't see just an employee. He saw a woman barely holding herself together. Someone breaking right there in the middle of his store. And what struck him the most wasn't the tears, but the silence. Elena smiled, yet in her eyes was a haunting emptiness, as if her heart had long stopped speaking. Adrian stood frozen, trapped in his own thoughts. In that moment, he remembered everything from the early days. Mornings with cracked hands, hauling crates at the docks, hurried bites of stale bread before a shift. Nights spent whispering promises to himself that if he ever had power, he would never let anyone endure the same. But now, he was staring at the proof that he had broken that very promise. Success had turned him into a stranger to people like Elena. And right then, Adrian realized something he had tried to ignore for far too long. Perhaps he was the very reason why smiles like hers had become so forced, why people like Elena had been left silent in their suffering. The soft clattering of cereal boxes being stacked echoed steadily from the aisle behind the checkout. Adrian remained still, his eyes fixed on Elena, but a quiet voice caught his attention. She missed 2 shifts because her son had a fever. The voice murmured wearily, lowered as if afraid someone else might hear. "Around here, if you miss work, you disappear." Adrian turned his head slightly. A thin young man, his glasses slipping down his nose, was carefully arranging boxes on the shelf. The name on his badge read, Rico Torres. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed a heavy box into place, but his voice stayed deliberately calm, as if he had long grown used to uttering bitter truths like this. Rico had no idea that the man listening to him was the owner of the entire store. Adrian studied him, a skinny young man with dark circles under his eyes from lack of sleep. And suddenly, an image surfaced in his mind. A young man from 15 years ago, himself, standing in a warehouse that smelled of engine oil, with blistered hands from hauling crates, whispering to a co-worker in the same tired voice. A sharp ache spread through Adrian's chest. The young man in front of him didn't know that his words were like a blade to Adrian, cutting straight into the memory of a promise he had once repeated to himself. If I ever succeed, I will never let people like me back then endure this. But that promise had long been buried beneath revenue reports and cold, lifeless numbers. Adrian suddenly realized he was no longer the dock worker he once was. He had become the man at the top of a system that was quietly crushing people like Rico and Elena. In that moment, his gaze lingered on the young man's glasses slipping down his nose, and a question pressed heavily into his mind. If nothing changes, how long can he survive in this cold, unfeeling machine? The small, cramped employee break room was drenched in the pale glow of flickering neon lights, casting a cold blue hue that made everything seem gloomier than it really was. Elena sat alone in the corner, her hands clutching a worn leather wallet so tightly that the frayed seams looked as if they might finally give way. She opened it, slowly, hesitantly, as though afraid that what was inside would hurt more than she could bear. The faint rustle of paper filled the silence, revealing the harsh reality of her life. A past, due electric bill, its bold red overdue stamp screaming louder than any words, stared back at her. The lifeless numbers felt like they were shouting her helplessness at her face. Elena touched the edge of the paper, just a light brush with her fingertips, then quickly set it back down as if holding on to it any longer might break her. Beneath the bill was a photo, its edges worn and curling. A little boy, no more than 4, with messy hair and a bright sun-like smile, his big round eyes sparkling with innocent joy. That boy, Lucas, was the only reason Elena managed to stand on her feet every single day, the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. But tonight, looking at that smile only made her heart tighten painfully. 3 coins tumbled from the wallet into her palm, making a faint, pitiful clink. She counted them twice, her lips moving silently, as if trying to solve an impossible equation. Those 3 coins would do nothing against the red, stamped bill on the table, nor could they magically turn into a warm, full dinner for Lucas. Elena closed her eyes and drew in a deep breath, forcing the tears to retreat. She placed the photo carefully back into her wallet, her movements slow, almost reverent, as though afraid to damage the only unbroken thing left in her life. Outside the break room, through the frosted glass and the narrow crack of the door, a pair of eyes watched quietly. Adrian leaned against a row of shopping carts near the entrance, his breath caught in his throat. He couldn't hear her, but he could see everything. The way Elena's hands trembled as she held the bill. The way her eyes softened with love and despair when she looked at her son's photo. The sight made Adrian clench his fist so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had been there once, years ago, counting his last few coins to pay rent, knowing the humiliation of not being able to afford a meal. But he had escaped. He had climbed to the very top. And now he, the man who had once sworn to protect people like Elena, stood there, watching that same hopelessness bloom right inside the system he had built. Elena wiped her eyes quickly, took another deep breath, and stood up. She adjusted her uniform, forced a fragile smile onto her face, and stepped out of the break room as if nothing had happened. But Adrian knew better. That smile was nothing more than a thin mask. He watched every step she took, his chest heavy with guilt. In that moment, Adrian no longer felt like a successful CEO. He felt like a man who had betrayed the very promise he had made to himself long ago. And for the first time, he truly understood. If he didn't act now, those fragile, forced smiles like Elena's would continue to appear, quietly torn within the cold machine he had created. That night, Adrian's office was lit only by the cold blue glow of the computer screen. Outside, the city buzzed with life. But in this quiet room, every sound seemed to vanish, leaving only the soft tapping of keys and his heavy, uneven breathing. Adrian sat motionless for a long moment before finally logging into the internal management system. The very system he had proudly approved and once called a breakthrough in workforce optimization. His fingers trembled slightly as he typed, "Store number 7, Elena Cruz." The words appeared instantly, clean, efficient, and merciless. Low priority, awaiting voluntary resignation. Adrian blinked, almost convinced he had read it wrong. But as he moved the cursor, more details emerged, cold and clinical, as if the verdict had already been decided. Reason: unscheduled absences, inconsistent work availability. There was no mention of the sick child she was caring for, no explanation for the missed shifts. The system didn't care. It only saw numbers, and it had branded her with one word: useless. Adrian inhaled sharply, his hand tightening around the mouse until the veins stood out on his knuckles. He typed another name: Rico Torres. The result was the same. Low priority, awaiting voluntary resignation. Then another: Linda Parks. Once again, the same cold verdict flashed across the screen. With every name, it felt as though his chest was being squeezed tighter. These weren't lazy or incompetent workers. They were parents with sick children, caretakers for aging parents, people juggling second jobs just to survive. But to the machine he had created, all of that boiled down to a single definition: unstable, disposable. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the screen as if staring at his own reflection. Not the reflection of a compassionate leader who once promised to protect workers like the man he had been years ago, but of someone who had allowed himself to be blinded by numbers and charts. He scrolled through Panna, Abtau of Halls and Pest. One name after another, each one marked with the same label. Every name represented a real life, with hopes, fears, sleepless nights, and skipped meals. But in the eyes of this system, they were nothing more than data points to be erased in the name of cost efficiency. A chilling thought sliced through Adrian's mind. I built a machine that kills hope. He sat there for a long time, the screen before him continuing to blink, updating itself with perfect, pristine numbers. But for the first time in years, those perfect numbers didn't fill him with pride. They terrified him. And for the first time in a very long time, Adrian felt true fear. Not fear of failure, but fear of what he had allowed himself to become. The next morning, the sky was overcast, heavy grey clouds drifting lazily as if mirroring Adrian's somber mood. He walked into store number 7 dressed in a sharp suit, no longer wearing the worn-out jacket, no longer the silent observer watching from the shadows. Today he was here as the man in charge, not to flaunt his authority, but to confront his own mistakes. The employees froze when they saw him enter. Some recognized him instantly, their eyes widening in shock, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Only one man seemed unfazed, even managing a faint, dismissive smile. Marcus Hale, the store manager. Marcus sat back in his chair, idly spinning a pen between his fingers, his expression smug. He stood slowly, offering a polite smile, though his eyes gleamed with condescension. "Welcome, Mr. Blake," Marcus said, deliberately emphasizing the title like a subtle insult. "I assume you're here to review our performance. The monthly report looks excellent. Labor costs are significantly reduced. Productivity is consistently rising, exactly as the system recommends." His tone was calm, but every word landed like a slap to Adrian's face. Adrian stood motionless, his gaze locked on Marcus. "Performance," he repeated, his voice low, each word deliberate. Marcus nodded confidently. "Exactly. I'm just following the system's recommendations. People who are unreliable, who miss shifts, who take too much time off for personal reasons, aren't worth keeping. I didn't fire them. I simply cut their hours. They leave on their own. That's smart management, Mr. Blake. We need dependable workers, not weak ones." The words cut through Adrian like a blade. He remained silent for a long moment, staring at the man in front of him, as if struggling to contain the anger building inside. Finally, Adrian drew a deep breath, his eyes sharpening, his voice dropping to a steely tone. "Smart," he echoed, his words heavy with restrained fury. "You call turning people into worthless names on a list, pushing them to desperation until they disappear from the system. Smart?" Marcus shrugged, that faint, smug smile still lingering. "That's business, Mr. Blake. Him, her, anyone can be replaced. We're doing exactly what needs to be done to deliver results." Adrian stepped forward, his composure cracking as anger edged his voice. "No, Marcus, that's not business. That's cruelty. And you're wrong about one thing. They're not numbers. They're human beings. And starting today, the way you run this store ends here." Marcus froze briefly at the sudden shift in Adrian's tone, but quickly regained his calm, crossing his arms, smirking with quiet defiance. "If you want to change things, go ahead. But remember, this is the model you built. I'm just following orders." For a moment, Adrian said nothing. Marcus was right. This was his system. But that was no longer an excuse to look away. Adrian's eyes hardened, filled with a resolve stronger than ever. He turned, his voice firm, unwavering. "You're right, Marcus. I built it. But today I'll be the one to tear it down, and you will no longer be part of this system." Store number 7 was heavy with silence, as Adrian stepped out of the manager's office. The steady beeping of barcode scanners continued, but uncertain eyes began to follow his every step. Adrian stopped in the center of the store, his voice low but firm as it carried across the room. "Everyone, gather here." Surprise flickered across the employees' faces. The murmurs slowly faded until there was nothing but quiet. One by one they moved closer, forming an awkward circle around him. Elena stood at the back, her hands trembling slightly as they tightened around her apron, while Rico stood silently beside her, his head lowered. Marcus appeared seconds later, still wearing his usual calm expression, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise. He crossed his arms and leaned casually against the wall as if he were just an observer. Adrian turned to him, his gaze unwavering. "Marcus Hale." Adrian's voice was steady, firm, leaving no room for argument. "You are suspended immediately." Ended. "From this moment, you no longer have the authority to manage store number 7. There were no cheers, no applause. Only a tense silence. The employees exchanged glances, some filled with confusion, others with quiet relief. Marcus's brow lifted slightly, his smug smile slipping, and he opened his mouth to protest, but Adrian cut him off. "You were right about one thing, Marcus. I built this system, but I will not allow it to become a machine that crushes the people working here." Adrian paused, his eyes sweeping over the faces gathered before him. "All of you," Adrian continued, his voice lower now, softer but full of emotion. "I have failed you. I forgot that behind every report, every number, are human beings fighting every single day just to get by. I let you be judged by empty labels, low priority, waiting to quit. That was my fault. Today, I am not standing here as your CEO. I am standing here as a quad, a man who has avoided his responsibility for far too long." The room was still, the weight of his words pressing into the silence. Elena lifted her head slightly, her eyes widening in surprise, while Rico shifted, as if trying to see him more clearly. Adrian drew a deep breath, his voice resonating again, stronger this time. "I don't expect your forgiveness, but I promise you, starting today, things will change. I will change." A long pause followed. Then a small but powerful gesture broke the silence. Rico, who had kept his head bowed since the beginning, nodded once, slow but resolute. Another employee followed, then another. Elena remained still, but her hands had stopped trembling. Adrian saw it all, and for the first time in years, he felt hope returning, not through flawless reports, but through the eyes of people who were finally starting to believe in him again. The air was still heavy after Adrian's declaration. He walked slowly past each employee, his gaze finally settling on Elena. She stood quietly at the end of the line, her hands gripping the edge of her apron, her shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to make herself smaller. When Adrian stopped in front of her, Elena instinctively lowered her head, avoiding his direct gaze. His voice, low and steady, carried clearly through the silence. "Elena Cruz." She flinched slightly at the sound of her name, but kept her eyes on the floor. Adrian continued, his words deliberate, as if each one carried its own weight. "I didn't come here to give you a reward, nor to offer you a promotion. I came to give back something you should never have lost. Your worth." Elena drew in a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she were speaking only to herself. "I don't deserve it." The words were fragile, yet loud enough for everyone to hear. Adrian shook his head, his eyes never leaving her bowed face, his voice firming with quiet conviction. "You deserve it more than anyone here. You kept standing when everything was against you. When your shifts were taken away, you still showed up. When no one noticed you, you still smiled at the customers. When no one asked how you were, you still did your job. That isn't weakness, Elena. That's strength. And you've been stronger in ways even I couldn't be." Elena lifted her head slightly, her eyes glistening with disbelief at the words she was hearing. Adrian took a small step back, his tone softening, but his gaze steady. "I allowed this system to erase your value. But starting today, no one has the right to do that anymore. Not even me." For a moment, a different kind of silence filled the room. Not one born of fear or doubt, but of trust slowly being rekindled. A tear slipped down Elena's cheek, but this time it wasn't the tear of despair. Her shoulders trembled, not from fear, but from something unfamiliar. The feeling of being seen, being heard, being acknowledged as a person who mattered. Adrian didn't say anything more. He stepped back, giving her space, but his gaze stayed on her, like a quiet promise that from this day forward, she would no longer have to fight alone. Elena lowered her head again, slowly, as if to hide her tear. Streaked eyes, but in her heart, for the first time in a very long time, a small spark of hope flickered to life. Marcus's old office now stood empty, holding only the lingering scent of stale coffee on the desk and the imprint of someone who had sat in the swivel chair for far too long. Elena paused at the doorway, her hand resting on the frame, as if unsure whether she had the right to step inside. The room wasn't large, but to her, it felt like a different world, a world she had never imagined she would ever enter. She walked in slowly, her shoes creaking softly against the floor. Her hand brushed across the surface of the desk, still faintly warm from the tense meetings Marcus once held there. She didn't sit down right away. Instead, her gaze moved to the whiteboard hanging on the wall. It was blank now, the smudged remnants of old notes waiting to be replaced with something new. Elena picked up the marker resting on the tray, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what this moment meant. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the marker against the cold surface of the board. The ink spread slowly, forming uneven but steady letters. She wrote carefully, each stroke carrying the weight of everything she had endured and everything she wanted to change. When she finished, she stepped back and looked at the words. "No one cries alone." 4 simple words, but to Elena, they were a vow. In that moment, she no longer felt like just an exhausted cashier or a struggling single mother burdened with unpaid bills. Standing in that room, she felt like someone who could make a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been left behind the way she had. She set the marker down and let out a slow breath. Her eyes glimmered, not with tears, but with the light of a determination newly ignited. Turning back, she sat down in the swivel chair Marcus had once occupied. The chair still felt slightly too big for her small frame, but for the first time, she felt she belonged there. Outside, the quiet hum of conversation drifted through the air. There was still weariness in the faces of the staff, but it was calmer now, no longer weighed down by fear. Elena leaned slightly toward the glass window, watching them work. She knew the road ahead would be long, but at least today change had begun. The next morning, store number 7 seemed to carry a completely different atmosphere. The light from the ceiling fixtures was still the same dull yellow as always, but the oppressive heaviness was gone. The beeping sound of barcode scanners echoed steadily. Yet this time, it was occasionally interrupted by small, hesitant laughs, genuine ones. Elena stood behind the checkout counter, her hands moving swiftly over the small bills, but her face was not the same as the day before. Her smile today was no longer forced. It wasn't the tired mask she had worn for so long, but a real smile, one that made customers smile back warmly. A middle-aged woman received her change, softly said, "Thank you." And Elena looked up, her eyes brighter, and replied, "Have a wonderful day." A simple phrase, yet it was the first time in a long while that she had spoken it with true sincerity. Rico was standing in the aisle between 2 rows of shelves, holding a box of cereal. An elderly woman with silver hair, moving slowly, was fumbling as she searched for a specific kind of whole grain bread. Normally, Rico would have stayed silent, pretending not to notice to avoid being scolded for wasting time. But today, he walked over, his voice quiet yet clear. "You're looking for whole grain bread, right? It's just in the next aisle, second shelf from the top." The old woman looked up, surprised for a moment, then smiled. "Thank you, dear." Rico scratched his head, smiling awkwardly, his cheeks slightly flushed. But in his eyes, for the first time, there was something that looked like pride. Linda, at register number 3, was the same. She handed change back to a customer, her hands still trembling slightly, but her smile no longer shied away. A young male customer looked at her, nodded slightly, and said, "Thank you." Linda responded with a firm nod, like a quiet promise that from now on she would do better, not because she feared losing her job, but because she finally felt seen. Adrian stood near the entrance, silently observing. Today he wasn't wearing a suit, nor did he have his CEO badge pinned to his chest. He wore a simple shirt, his hands tucked into his pockets, looking like any ordinary customer. No one paid attention to him, and that was exactly what he wanted. He didn't need to lead today. He only wanted to watch the store breathe on its own, run by people who were no longer weighed down by fear or burdened by silence. Inside Adrian, there was a strange feeling. It wasn't victory, nor was it satisfaction. It was the feeling of someone learning again how to be human. And he knew this was only the beginning. That morning, sunlight slanted across the rows of low buildings, casting a soft golden hue over the narrow street. Elena walked slowly, her hand gently holding Lucas's tiny one. The boy skipped beside her, his small shoes tapping a steady rhythm against the tiled pavement. His face was bright with joy, his eyes sparkling like little stars. As they approached the school gate, Lucas suddenly looked up at his mother and asked in his innocent, happy voice, "Mom, you're not going to cry today, right?" Elena paused for a brief moment, her heart tightening at the tender question. Memories of exhausting nights and the times she swallowed her tears, staring at overdue bills, flashed through her mind. But today was different. She crouched down, bringing herself to Lucas's eye level, and smiled softly. For the first time in a long while, a smile that reached her eyes. "That's right, Lucas," she whispered, her voice trembling but certain. "I'm not going to cry today." Lucas smiled, his small hands squeezing hers tighter, as if he too understood that his mother was truly stronger now. As Elena stood and watched her son walk through the school gate, a new sense of hope crept into her heart. For the first time in endless months, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. A short distance away, near the parking lot of store number 7, Adrian Blake stood in silence. He wasn't wearing a suit, nor did he carry the commanding presence of a powerful CEO. He looked like any ordinary man, hands tucked into his pockets, staring up at the large, bright red sign that read, "Blake Mart." For years, that sign had been a symbol of success, something he proudly showcased to the press and boasted about in speeches to investors. But today, as he looked at it, there was no pride left. The bold, glowing letters felt more like a monument, not for the business, but for the people who had been forgotten behind it. Adrian took a deep breath, letting the morning breeze sweep through his hair. There was no arrogance in his heart, only a quiet, honest feeling. He was finally seeing again the people he had once overlooked. And perhaps, for the first time in many years, he no longer saw himself as a great leader. He was just a man learning how to be human again, a man willing to bow his head and face his own mistakes. He smiled faintly, not at the sign, not at the success it represented, but at Elena, Rico, Linda, and all the people who had endured and stood strong through those harsh months. And in his heart, a question echoed, not for himself, but for everyone. Elena stood up. "What about you?" The question lingered quietly in the air, with no immediate answer. But sometimes, questions don't need answers. They only need to be heard, so that everyone can find their own when the time comes. Sometimes, a sincere apology and the right decision can change an entire life. Today's story is not just about a CEO making things right, but a reminder for all of us to reflect on how we treat the people around us. If you believe that everyone deserves respect, hit like to help spread this message, subscribe so you won't miss the next inspiring stories, and don't forget to leave a comment with 3 words, "I agree," if you also believe that change begins with us.